or we're all just going to be up the whole time? You can hide your screen if you like. If you want to go forward, feel free. It's up to you.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
And good afternoon or good morning, depending upon where you are in the world, everyone. This is Edward Jones, Director of Programs for APSI, and I want to welcome you to a very timely and important conversation that we're going to have today, Black Power 50, a funded conversation. I'm really honored to not only be part of hosting on behalf of APSI this conversation, but the timeliness of it all as the calendar would allow for us to be talking about this important topic. And then also giving a shout out to the Neighborhood Pundits Group, which is where I am in Oakland, California, on this day, having this conversation and having met Erica Huggins and Landon Williams, two former members of the Black Panther Party while here in Oakland, understanding that our leaders, even in the midst of the loss of the great Muhammad Ali, we have some amazing leaders that are still with us that are leading this movement, leading Black Power, speaking Black Power every day. So I want you all to just be prepared to ask questions, be prepared to get engaged, and most importantly, be prepared to be inspired to lead with Black Power wherever you are. And so with that, I'd like to introduce you to Alvin Starks, who's going to carry us through this discussion. As you've just seen too, there is this need for you to be mindful of the phones being muted, but in the right column on your right control panel is where we're going to ask you to post questions. Please, you can feel free to start posting those questions or reflections now, but we will read those questions at the appropriate time because we want this to be an interactive and an engaging discussion. So enjoy and take it away, Alvin.
Thank you, Edward, and welcome everyone. As Edward said, this is a very timely conversation and it's equally as exciting. For many of us who have been a part of the philanthropic industry, talking about Black Power or social justice and racial justice sometimes happens in private. This is definitely a moment where we're actually taking a little bit more of a deeper dive into what Black Power means, not just within the advocacy field today, but also what does it mean to us as makers. Next slide, please. So what I want to do is just provide a bit of an overview of how the discussion will unfold. First, there will be a welcome and an overview that I'm doing right now. There'll be a series of webinar presentations from our panelists, and then there will be a Q&A with the panel and then closing comments. As Edward said earlier, I think it's really important for folks to use the technology to really give us questions in the ongoing conversation. We're trying to get as many questions answered during the presentation, and obviously this is the type of conversation that doesn't end after an hour and 30 minutes. Next slide, please. So it's extremely opportunistic, I must admit, and almost a little serendipitous that we're here having this conversation on this particular day. Usually we do these API webinars every third Thursday of the month, well, every other month. Today just happens to be the commemorative 50th anniversary of the term Black Power. And just to give us a bit of a footnote in history, it had been used before that date, but it really becomes popularized during a very impassioned speech from Stokely Carmichael as he was talking to a group of organizers in Greenwood, Mississippi, addressing the shooting of civil rights leader James Meredith. What's interesting about this particular moment is that Meredith becomes wounded because he's trying to advance Black people to vote based upon the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I say this because I think it's really important for us to understand and put this in a context of where Black Power really emerges. So we definitely have civil rights moments and movements which are incredibly important. And then when we try to advance those or really enforce those movements, they still become a bit frayed in the American politics. And so Black Power was really meant to make that bridge from civil rights to reality. Next slide, please. And you see, Stokely Carmichael, like many of the activists at that moment, were really pioneers and very daring. They influenced, next slide please, they influenced a whole movement of folks that began to talk about Black Power more than just a term, seizing upon it not just as a slogan, but young people began to develop countless political, social, and cultural economic programs under this big banner called Black Power. It wasn't just in the U.S., and I think this is something that people are slowly finding out. It really was a global phenomenon. Next slide, please. Iconically, people actually understand it, with the searing images, which I think we will also talk about. But it's also the moment when we begin to see modern civil and human rights movements become much more conscientious of their images. Next slide, please. The power framework is that actually was both an intellectual, social, and an artistic one. It was really to address these eroding civil rights protections. It later becomes really influential to how Dr. Martin Luther King begins to kind of understand the civil rights industry. It also produces something even much more magnificent in the Black arts movement. It's also the moment of where we're beginning to see the promotion of Black studies programs, and you see these dynamic grassroots activism really emerging from the grassroots. Next slide, please. I say that because I think oftentimes many of us don't really understand the influence and the impact of the Black Power movement. Slide gives you just a thumbnail sketch, right? You're seeing youth food programs, you're seeing sickle cell testing, voter registration, you're seeing running for elected offices, the international and global identity of Africana and Africanistic expressions. You see this notion around moving towards securing human rights and dignity. We see effective communications really emerging. We're seeing folks really set up local offices in neighborhoods. We're seeing grassroots funding efforts. We're seeing the creation of, again, Black studies programs as well as Black arts movement. What's interesting about, that kind of laundry list, and it's much more than that, I mean, you realize that it really is much more influential and much more connected to the work that many of the foundations would like to see, right? Next slide, please. Many folks are aware that, the Panthers were very much like pioneers towards bringing in youth into food sciences, really making the ideological connection between you do well in school when you are well fed. Next slide, please. We also know that it's a movement that began to really understand the importance of newspapers, media, images, and these were really purposely done as a way to really redress highly racialized images. You have to remember this is really coming from a post-Jim Crowism era, the notion of actually how Black people were presented, not just in pop culture, but also in politics really mattered. And so the establishment of the word power becomes a way of actually infusing, empowerment for individuals. Next slide. And we begin to kind of understand, Black is beautiful, which is really when that phrase becomes really well coined. So I want to kind of make the connection to what that means for us today. Next slide. It's interesting that you see a new generation looking at the Black Power movement, not just because of its anniversarial conditions, but also because what does it mean for young Black people today in this generation as they formulate political ideas. Even recently we see it with the West Point graduates, we see it in popular films, folks like Firelight Media, we see it at the Super Bowl with entertainer Beyonce. We also begin to kind of see a common link around the framing of Black Lives Matter, Black Power, Black is Beautiful. All those constructions really are coming to an edge, as well as we're seeing effective communications showing up. So the question for us, I think, at this table is, how can philanthropy constructively respond to these new cultural norms? How does all this stuff really relate to effective grant making? Next slide, please. So the next slide gives you a little sense of even politically, you have these Black women who are recent graduates of West Point. I think this was either in April or May of this year. But also, one slide I wish we actually put in here as well is, of course, the passing of Muhammad Ali. What becomes really interesting about his own development as a person really fits very passionately into the Black Power dialogue. Next slide. Again, this webinar is really meant for us to really get a historical framework and what it really means for us today in looking at how we advance grassroots leaderships and organizations that really are working towards advancing justice, equity, and the fulfillment of Black communities. Next slide. What we wanted to do is to really, and what we've achieved is actually bring together leading thinkers, individuals that we think actually have context and new ideas to share with us. Next slide. So I want to give a brief introduction of our panelists. Many of you know Makani Simba, who I hope will join us shortly. I know that she's a bit delayed, but we may recall Makani was the former executive director, founder, I think, of Praxis Project. She's currently the chief strategist at Higher Ground Change Strategies. We are also welcoming Dante Berry, executive director of Million Hoodies Movement for Justice. We also have Nat Chioke Williams, executive director of the Hill Snowden Foundation. And last but not least, Sonia Childress, director of partnerships and engagement at Firelight Media. So I do encourage you to give us questions as these conversations begin to unfold. We will do a larger Q&A at the end, but we are collecting those questions in advance. So what I would like to do is actually go to Dante while we wait for Makani. Let's go to Dante's slide, if we may. Dante, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. We can hear you. So I would like to introduce Dante Berry. There you go, Dante.
Well, thank you all so much for, you can hop onto the next slide if you can. Thank you all so much for the invitation to join y'all. So my name is Dante Berry, and I'm the executive director of Million Hoodies Movement for Justice. We were founded in 2012 in the wake of the murder of Trayvon Martin, in large part because of the media's failure to adequately report on the events leading to Trayvon's death and after his death. We realized that at that moment we needed to focus on building new leaders to respond to what we identify as the growing democracy crisis of mass criminalization, anti-Blackness, and systemic violence. That the reason why we have gun violence, particularly in this country, the reason why we have mass criminalization is because there has been a continued crisis in democracy that has specifically excluded Black people for generations. And that in order for us to really rebuild and think about a democracy that works, we need to think and center Black people and young Black people in particular in that conversation. So our mission is to build new leaders who are organizing locally using advocacy and education as strategies to build a democracy that works. So I, in particular, grew up in a small town called Mount Holly, New Jersey, and always grew up fascinated learning about different Black organizational formations. I was really fascinated by the Black Panthers. I was very much so fascinated by the Cambaya River Collective and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And I always looked to them as examples or models for how organization has formed for Black people, for young Black people, and responding to the current conditions, just as much as we have organizations like Million Hoodies and other organizations in the ecosystem that are also responding in these moments, these high crisis moments for Black people. So what does that mean, right? And what are the questions, what are the things that we're thinking about in relation to being a part of a long history of Black organizing and a Black movement? So I wanna dive into, if you can go on to the next slide, dive into some examples of emerging strategies that we're observing, and just some key points I want to lift up. So one big thing that we're seeing is that there's been a prioritization of leadership development and building grassroots local power. There's energy behind being a part of a network. We're organized as a network. We have chapters. We have 6 chapters across the country, and we're engaging young Black people, students, and young people who are organizing along the margins. And this is important because when we think about some of the issues that are impacting us and that we often don't necessarily don't necessarily have the capacity to respond, it's happening at the state and local level. And this work is also we have the most opportunity because as we've seen in Chicago through the organizations like Black Youth Project 100, in response to the Laquan McDonald case, we're also thinking about both inside-outside strategies to engage young Black people around holding elected officials accountable, holding prosecutors accountable, in ways that we haven't necessarily thought about. So there has been a prioritization of leadership development, building grassroots local power, and creating new types of campaigns, looking really at the way that we're governed and how we can actually build governing power as well. A second key strategy that has been coming up and emerging is the integration of online and offline organizing. We started off as an online organization primarily, and when I came into the organization in 2013, that's when we kind of moved into a place of thinking about, well, we actually really need to also complement that with a network of leaders who can respond to these moments ongoing and are also building relationships and building the power necessary so that we can change the hearts and minds of ordinary people around the systems that we are impacted by. And so we're seeing that through different types of campaigns. We're seeing that through different types of mediums. We have a platform called Push Black that's really using technology in order to connect people, particularly around media, to connect folks to the issues that we're connected to. Another key strategy that's emerging is having a global intersectional politic and practice for an interconnected movement for Black liberation grounded in history. This is, I think, probably one of the most important things that we've, as an organization, have cherished, is that it's not just only important to have the issues that we care about be intersectional, something that our leaders have determined that anything that we do across issue, across identity, must be intersectional, so that we are talking about climate justice, that we are talking about gender-based violence, and we're always talking about how it's impacting those communities that are often most marginalized and most invisible. But it's also important for us to have a practice of how we are using these issues as campaign frameworks. The ability to actually use a feminist framework in the work that we're doing and the decisions that we're making as an organization. In addition to having, making sure that we are being cognizant of our transphobia and making sure that we're not making decisions based upon that, right? And so how do we also, the question is about how do we also create a new world that folks are actually living in addition to being able to build power. And that's very something similar to what Kwame in the Black Power movement often talks about, is that Black power is also this idea of redefining our institutions and our culture and our shape and form, and a lot of that has a lot to do with how we're organizing and how we're shifting culture today. Direct action puts the pop and popular movement building. You've seen this really since everything has taken off in 2014, but we've seen this in other movements, right? That direct action has created the visibility that we need in order to spotlight certain issues and also hold elected officials accountable and to build power. And this is something I think is going to continue to be a growing thing, and it's something that we also need to think about how we resource as well, because it's often not always a sexy thing, because a lot of folks often wonder, oh, maybe that's not the right target or not the right strategy. But we also have to be cognizant that this is a way of how we're building a new democracy that works for Black people. And then another key important thing that I want to lift up is that there's a desire to build what has never been done before, right? There's a desire to create new types of institutions, new types of practices, new types of ideas to build a democracy that works for young Black people. We're going through a process ourselves in the coming months where we're going to be releasing an agenda that is both reflective of the conditions that we're in today, but also reflective of the conditions that that we want to be living in, right? Dreaming the new world and not just living in the reality that we live in. And so there's ways that we can think about how do we actually not just create the idea that Black people can just survive, but how do we actually create the idea of Black people thriving in their communities. So there's that desire as well. And then the final big piece that I wanna touch on is the use of art and culture shifting. Like art and culture shifting matters. Art matters. Black artists matter. And the idea that we can't do this work as organizers. We can't do this work in a vacuum. And we have artists who are also part of our organization who are using their skill set to bring in new people, because oftentimes many folks are not necessarily interested in having those one-off conversations about politics, but they are interested in connecting around the music and are interested in connecting around film. And so we're using art and culture to think about how can we present information and present the issues and present the new world in a way, en masse, in a way that can be digestible and connect on a human level. So art and culture shifting matters. And I wanted to lift up all of these things because these strategies are emergent of the new organizations that have been forming in response to this movement and the movement for Black Lives ecosystem. And it's often about also a confrontation of power, and it's not also it's an engagement of our current structure, but also a question about what is our new structure going to be where Black people can actually live in safe and thriving communities. And all of these things are also about how do we create new and connected systems and institutions that work for all of us? Because fundamentally when Black people get free, everyone else gets free. And when Black women get free, in particular, when Black trans women get free, everyone else gets free. And so what does that actually mean in our practices and how we're investing in Black-led organizations for the development of these ideas and of these strategies? Next slide, please, and we'll close. You can go to the next slide if you can, please. There we go. So to build a democracy that works, we need to prioritize investing in Black-led local organizing. And I will be very upfront and clear that there actually has not been a lot of investments in Black-led local organizing. And there also hasn't necessarily been a lot of investments in the larger ecosystem around Black organizing, right? And so I want to throw up some opportunities to really think about that in relationship to all of these things, right? Is that there's opportunities to hold some largely individual local decision makers accountable. I think one thing that has been a weakness of the left, of the progressive movements, is that we haven't been able to take over essentially state and local office and races in the way that we need. And we need to do that through organizing. And we need to do that through Black-led organizing. There's also an opportunity coming up around the census in 2020 when there's redistricting coming up, right? It's like when we think about and hear language about what does it mean for a emerging majority nation, right? That might not necessarily mean anything if those emerging majority folks don't have power or don't have the resources to survive. So how are we creating the structures, the ideas, the platforms, the strategies in order for us to create the way of being that we want to be living in, right? And so redistricting census is really important in that consideration, as much as it is around 2042. So I want to put up as a question for folks, if we are really interested in building a democracy that's going to work for Black people and for other communities of color, how can we think about the years ahead as frameworks for what those investments look like, and really thinking about how the state is expanding at a number of levels. If you look at the cases in North Carolina, which we have members, which you can see some in the picture there, there are spaces where a lot of these fights are happening at the state level. And many of these organizations, many groups in the ecosystem are under-resourced to really support these fights because we're fighting on other fronts. And we also don't have those resources. So please, 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 this is more of an ask, just to think and consider about how can we invest and prioritize Black-led local organizing across the country. Thank you.
Ante, thank you for that. That was excellent. And really appreciated the fact of you actually introducing and starting us off with a holistic understanding and framework, Black movement building, and in particular your intersectional analysis, which I thought was really rich. The quote that you have around building a democracy that works for Black people, I think, is a really good tool for us as we kind of go through this conversation. And I have tons of questions for you, and I know others do as well. So I'm going to ask people to really post their questions on the computer terminal so that we can actually capture those. Dante, for that. I want to take us to our next, please. I want to bring us to our next speaker, James, who is the Executive Director at the Hill Foundation. Matt, it's your turn.
Hi, thanks, Alvin. Thanks, everybody, for participating in this really important conversation today. I actually want to just give a big up to Dante for bringing a topic that I want to build on a little bit more, and which is getting the popular term of foundation redlining, right? And so this whole idea of not supporting historically within philanthropy, Black-led organizations, and then specifically Black-led organizing and power building organizations. So I want to talk about that in a little bit, but I just wanted to make that connection. So the Hill Foundation, just really quickly, is a smallest family foundation that supports community organizing nationally, and we do that through youth organizing and economic justice organizing. We have a fund to support the capacity building infrastructure for organizing in the District of Columbia. We direct a fair portion of our work, about 60 to 70% of our grant making goes towards the U.S. South as an area of particular need and underinvestment. And then last year, we launched a new initiative called the Making Black Lives Matter initiative, and I'm going to spend the time talking about that today. But I really appreciate being asked to speak today, not just because of the historic topic of commemorating the popular birth of the term Black Power 50 years ago today, but also because it was due to a speaking opportunity on a similar AFB webinar a year and a half ago that I began to start articulating a kind of rediscovered focus on building power explicitly for the Black community and Black freedom that I had prior to coming into philanthropy, but that sort of got massaged away over the years. And so, you know, I've learned a lot and done some things over the last 18 months around the issue of strengthening Black power, and Alvin wanted me to share some of my personal experiences, some of the my foundation's journey in this work. But first I wanted to make a few opening comments about Black power and Blackness from my perspective. So as I said, over the last 18 months, I've done several things. One of the things that I've done consciously was to make a shift from using the term African American to using the term Black, referring to Black people. And I'm not only doing this because it's a more inclusive and actually accurate term representing the African diaspora, but more importantly because when we use the term Black in relation to Black people, it's a term of power and resistance in our political context. And so Blackness, to me, is a political state of being, or the state of being political. And it embodies our struggle for freedom and our enduring belief that we will make things right, but we will make things right through our own hands and through our own means. And so for me, Black power is the concrete and collective articulation of Black people's struggle for freedom and liberation. And Black power is inherently a direct challenge to white supremacy and a challenge to the status quo, and that's why it's been so fiercely opposed and repressed over the years. And so I think it's of critical importance that we reclaim the political content of Blackness and be unapologetic, be unequivocal about the need for Black social change and for cultivating Black leadership for social change. Because in this society, we can be Black aesthetically, you know, often in caricature, But when we start to become black politically, then there's a problem, right? And so in the context of social change, I talk about three types of black power. Black social power, which is the ability to influence and shape the way that black people think about issues and themselves, and the ability to inspire people to action. So that's what we've seen over the last 2 years in what's become to be known as the Black Lives Matter movement. The ability to not just bring up the issue around anti-black racism, but to make it central in the public and political discourse. The second type of power is black institutional power, and that's the structural capacity that's necessary to move forward an agenda for social change in a strategic and coordinated fashion over time. And for me, institutional power refers to the strength and the stability, the breadth, the depth, the connectedness of the ecosystem of organizations and institutions that are engaged in moving forward an agenda for black social change. And then finally, black political power is the ability to influence and change how systems operate. So change in policy, change in practice, but it also refers to the ability to win concrete changes in laws and in institutional policy and practice, and ultimately change the social and economic conditions of the black community. So philanthropy can have an important role to play, and indeed has an obligation in helping to reinvigorate the infrastructure for black social, institutional, and political power. And it can do this through its role as a grantor and its role as a convener, but it must do so following the lead of the black community. However, as Dante said and I said earlier, philanthropy has been recalcitrant in supporting black-led power organizations, and it's critical that we have an organized, sustained, strategic, and collective effort within philanthropy to push it to make affirmative action to strengthen the infrastructure for black-led social change. And like I said earlier, foundation redlining is a real thing, and a large part of our current initiative that we're trying to reverse and change the practice of philanthropy. So talk a little bit about, and next slide please, talking a little bit about the evolution of our work around Black Power building in the Hillstone Foundation. So again, a year ago, we inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement, the Hillstone Foundation developed and launched the Making Black Lives Matter initiative, which is a 3-year, $900,000 grant-making and strategic leveraging initiative that seeks to help strengthen and revitalize the infrastructure for black institutional and political power by supporting black-led organizing, black leadership development, and strategic convening for black racial and social justice leaders. And also in partnership with AFSCME, Hillstone is also coordinating the Black Social Change Funders Network to advocate significantly more philanthropic resources for black-led social change, and also to make those investments more strategic as we do the work together. Our overall framework is that, again, in order to support, that we're supporting black-led organizations as a means of revitalizing the institutional infrastructure and leadership pipeline for social change in the black community. Because we've seen through direct attacks, through COINTELPRO and other things following the Black Power movement, through the lack of funding, as I was talking about foundation redlining, and just in some ways kind of benign neglect, the infrastructure, the organizational infrastructure for black institutional political power has been degraded over the last 40 years. And because of that, we are not in a position as a community to not only advance an agenda, but also sometimes develop a cohesive, coherent agenda for the change that we need within this current era. So the long-term goals for the Making Black Lives Matter initiative are four. One is to actually win policy, help to support groups that can actually win policy to remove racialized barriers and produce concrete outcomes to enable black communities and black people to cross a spectrum of multiple issues. One of the things that I think has happened within philanthropy over the past 2 years, philanthropy being to some degree led or being responsive to the organizing going on in black communities around Black Lives Matter movement. Most of the resources that have been generated, most of the interest that has been generated, has necessarily been focused on policing and criminal justice, and that a critically important area of investment, but Black life and Black folk exist in a range of different issues and a range in the spectrum. And so I think it's important to also, as we are looking for policy wins, to not just have this myopia around what issues are defining Black life and really look at the broad spectrum. And so that's why we're also trying to support, in terms of our long-range goals, a dynamic, strong, connected, and powerful Black-led and allied ecosystem for building power for the Black community across any issue. And then we also want to see notable progress in shifting the public discourse and prevailing narrative that so often delegitimizes the need for Black social change and justice. And then finally, significantly increase support for and coordination to strengthen Black institutional power within philanthropy. Next slide, please. So the issues that we are focused on in the Making Black Lives Matter initiative, again, we developed 5 issues in coordination with groups like BOLD and other Black organizers around the country. So the issues that we are looking at in our particular initiative is criminalization. So that does include policing, but it also includes what happens to folks when they're incarcerated and what happens when they get out. So a broad spectrum. We're looking at economic justice with a particular focus on employment and the Black jobs crisis as a foundational issue that stops Black communities from thriving. Looking at public education, particularly as it relates to the de-democratizing of public spaces and education, and also the lack of say that Black communities have in decisions around school closures and charter schools. Looking at affordable housing and anti-gentrification work, and we're also looking at civic engagement and accountable governance. And within all of this, we are emphasizing the need to prioritize the leadership of Black women and youth in organizations that are located in the South and also in the Midwest. And we're presenting this as a frame to philanthropy that said, if you are really interested in supporting Black lives mattering and Black communities thriving, you at least need to invest heavily and perpetually in these core issues, realizing there are a range of other issues that are critical, but these are also some foundational issues as well. You can find out more about our framing and the organization we support on our website, which is not really coming up clearly on the slide, but it's makingblackliveslatter.org. And one of the things that we also did as a part of this initiative is to literally help put several Black-led organizing groups that are off the radar on the map. And so we created a Black-led organizing map that's featured on the website, makingblackliveslatter.org, and it's about 162 Black-led organizing groups across about 12 different issues across the country. There are several groups. There are groups, scores of groups that are doing work, courageous work on a daily basis, but the main thing that they have in common is that they are under-resourced and under-capacity, as Dante was saying earlier. The other aspect of the initiative is this leveraging piece within philanthropy, trying to organize within philanthropy through the Black Social Change Funders Network. And in 3 goals there, advocating again for more philanthropic resources to strengthen the infrastructure for Black social, institutional, and political power, trying to align and coordinate the grant making that does happen in order to maximize the strategic impact, and sharing information about developments and opportunities and needs to help build the capacity of individual program officers and foundations to do this work. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that, actually go back to this prior slide, I'm sorry. So one of the things that people have asked me, a question that I get a lot is, how was I able to get my board, which is an all-white trustees, support an initiative that is so pointedly focused on building Black institutional and political power? So one answer to that is that over the last 12 years, I've spent a lot of time with them, exposing the board members to the issues and the people that we support, so that they build their own relationships, they build their own understanding, so that in moments like this, they recognize the historic need and the need to act. And so, you know, I was actually trying to work around the edges of trying to get some money to Black-led organizing groups. I was like, maybe I could move some money here. It was actually my board members that came and said, look, we need to put up some more money in this historic moment. And we need to figure out how to commit the resources we can in addition to what we're already doing to support this work. And so it was my task to develop the frame. But I think because of that cultivating work I've done over the last 12 years with my board, they were ready to put forth the need to act in a more cohesive way. And so our mission, though, this is the first time, though, that we have explicitly or have been explicit about anti-Black structural racism in our work, and explicitly emphasize Black-led organizing and power building. So, you know, like many foundations, we talk about racial justice and racial equity, but we've never been we haven't been specific about it until now. And our mission is to work with low-income families and communities to help to create a fair and just society. And so our programmatic and rhetorical approach prior to this initiative was, I think, similar to many other progressive foundations in that we assumed that racial justice work and work against anti-Black structural racism was baked into our programs, baked into our grant making, because we supported grassroots community organizing almost exclusively with low-income communities of color. However, if you look a little closer at our work, and I think, again, the work of a lot of other foundations, the unspoken implication of our approach is that it subordinates race to class and tacitly, although sometimes unintentionally, reinforces the seductive decline in significance of race theory of social and racial inequity. And so, you know, in this society, there's a pervasive and overwhelming norm to deny and ignore anti-Black structural racism and to justify structural violence that is leveled against the Black community and to delegitimize the ongoing need for a nationwide commitment to repairing and making amends for the structural damage of anti-Black racism and white supremacy. And so phrases like reverse racism and colorblindness and post-racialism and race card, all these things were developed strategically and developed and deployed in response to the successes of the civil rights and Black power movement to negate the righteous demand for social change in the Black community. And all the while, social narratives like the culture of poverty and hypercriminality of Black men and Black women as welfare queens, et cetera, have been used to justify draconian policies and have torn Black families apart and limited our ability to thrive. But also on the progressive side, homogenizing terms like people of color and multiracial and racial justice can have a similar impact. They can have the perhaps unintentional effect of erasing the political, social, and historical distinctiveness of the struggle for freedom and justice in the Black community as distinct from other communities of color. And so the notion that anti-Black structural racism is baked into the work of nonprofits or baked into the work of philanthropy minimizes its singular importance in perpetuating social inequity and reinforces the practice of avoiding explicit treatment of anti-Black structural racism in our work and our society overall. And the reason why I have shifted to focusing specifically on naming Black and Blackness is because when I look over my writing in social justice and racial justice work over the last 15 years of philanthropy, I realized that I rarely use the term Black, right? And I got into philanthropy coming from a much more radical perspective in terms of Black liberation work and organizations. But over the last 15 years, that urgency, that fierceness, that focus has been slowly and subtly massaged out. And I saw through my own experience that this growing political insubstantiality of the Black community, as we've been rendered invisible in the conservative, colorblind construction of the world, and also as we're losing our political distinctiveness and power as we're dissolved in this progressive multiracial melting pot. And so over the last 18 years, what I really learned is that we have to be exceedingly explicit, vigilant, and unapologetic in naming anti-Black structural racism as a fundamental issue in order to break free from this culturally normative and strategic subordination of anti-Black structural racism and to resist the delegitimization of Black liberation work. So I probably only have like another minute. So what I'm going to do really quickly is address a question that Alvin brought up is what's needed in philanthropy, in the field of philanthropy to advance a larger framework for Black power. So next slide, please. So So in perhaps this narrow window of time that we have right now, when some parts of the philanthropic sector are actually interested and invested in Black-led organizing and movement building, I think we need to do a few things. One is that we need to go beyond just supporting a few groups here and there, even groups that we consider to be anchor groups. And so what I'm talking about is that we need to look at this moment as a building ground and answer the questions of what are the things that if we have them in place, what's the infrastructure? If we have that in place, what would that infrastructure be that could significantly propel the ability for Black communities to act strategically, forcefully, and effectively to advance our own interests on a range of issues in an array of places? And even if this window of time and interest slams shut, what are those things that we can leave behind in this moment and put in place that will help build power for the Black community to matter inside? And so the Black Social Change Funders Network has developed a theory of change that we think within philanthropy, we're trying to organize to do a few things. The first is to, again, build a powerful, robust, sustainable Black-led infrastructure and ecosystem for Black social change so that Black communities can thrive and be free. Our focus is on philanthropy, but particularly social change or social justice philanthropy, such that we can significantly increase the strategic investment for infrastructure building for Black-led social change. And then finally, our strategy has three components. Advocacy. We want to focus on educating and making the case within the philanthropic sector for the need to support Black-led social change and to promote a specific advocacy agenda. So what's the dollar amount, that we need to invest in for just revitalizing and building and strengthening the infrastructure for Black social change? We also are looking at capacity building as another core activity. So to educate and enhance the knowledge and effectiveness and leadership of individual program officers within foundations, and also individual foundations that are, again, now more recently developing programs around anti-Black structural racism specifically and organizing. And finally, we want to try to facilitate some strategic co-funding vehicles such that we can help to direct interest in a particular place. But I want to be really clear that we need to do this, again, led by, informed by, in deep partnerships with the field, right? It is not philanthropy's place nor capacity to develop what the strategy is for creating the type of change we need to see in the Black community on the ground. That has to be led by practitioners and folks in the community. But there is a core infrastructure that I think that we can look to try to see to develop that, again, a vibrant and well-resourced organizational ecosystem for Black-led social change. I think regular strategic convening among a cross-section of Black social change leaders is important, and it can help to stimulate the development of not necessarily a unitary agenda for Black social change, but for be in dialogue around different approaches, different strategies, and different visions for how that change can happen, and hopefully have the connected relationships so that we can move that forward. So I know I've spoken for a long time, and I'm going to end there. And there are a couple other slides you can jump over next so that Sonia can cue up hers. But thank you.
Nat, thank you for that. That was excellent, and I love some of the new language that you've actually introduced to this conversation. Foundation redlining, I hadn't heard that before. So I don't know if that's a phrase that you've coined, but I've got a million questions for you and everyone else on the panel. And again, if you have questions, we do encourage you to actually use the medium here to post your questions. Last but not least, we're excited to really have Sonia Childress from Firelight Media. She serves as the Director of Partnerships and Engagement. And many of us have actually seen the recent film, which I think has been powerful and important at this particular moment. So without further ado, I really want to introduce Sonia to the table to really share her remarks. Sonia, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Alvin, and thanks, Edward, for inviting me and Firelight to share a bit about what happened with our most recent film on the Panthers. But first, for folks who aren't familiar with Firelight Media, Firelight is a Harlem-based documentary production company and media organization. It is the production company for Stanley Nelson, who's a veteran documentary filmmaker, a MacArthur Genius Fellow, a National Humanities Medalist, who's been making documentaries mostly for public television for a couple of decades. And it's also run by his partner and wife, Marcia Smith, who's a veteran philanthropist and has been working in government for many years. And Firelight Media is 15 years old, and most of what we do is support the productions that Stanley Nelson put out. Those are films that really center the African-American experience in U.S. history, and some of the titles are Marcus Garvey, Look for Me in the Whirlwind, The Murder of Emmett Till, Jonestown, Life and Death of People's Temple, Freedom Riders, Freedom Summer. But in addition to the filmmaking that Stanley does, we also have a documentary lab where we support and mentor the next generation of filmmakers of color, and we have about 20 filmmakers from around the country who we support as they're finishing their documentary films. And then we also have my division, which is the audience engagement and impact division, so making sure that once these really powerful narratives about our experiences are completed, that we connect them with communities around the country, and we use these films as to both shift hearts and minds and policy, so that we have this sort of engagement part of the work that we do. So I'm going to share, Alvin asked me to share a little bit about a little case study of what happened with our most recent film, The Black Panthers Vanguard of the Revolution, as a sort of case study of how culture and narrative can support organizing and support conversations in this really important moment. So I'm going to share a little bit of what we did and some lessons that we learned about the power of narratives that center our experience. So I was going to show a trailer, but we can skip to the next slide, and then the slide after that. The trailer is not syncing up well, but you can watch the trailer on the blackpanthers.com, our film website. But for folks who haven't seen the film was a 2-hour look at the rise and fall of the Black Panther Party. It wasn't simply a look at individuals within the party, but really tried to take a 360 view of how the party evolved, the various changes it went through, and the forces that brought it down, both externally through FBI surveillance and suppression, and internally with power struggles. So it essentially was set up to be one of the most comprehensive looks at the Black Panther Party. And the film aired publicly on PBS this February 2016. We can skip to the next slide. So the film was completed in 2014, and we knew that the film was going to get a broadcast nationally on PBS in 2016. We knew that the film was going to be releasing during a really historic moment, both politically and culturally. So we knew a few things were going to be happening. We knew that the film would air during the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Black Panther Party this October, and that there were going to be lots of conversations, events, and activities to commemorate the 50th. And we knew that the Panthers were really mobilizing around their 50th, and we wanted to be able to support that with the release of the film. Clearly, we knew that, when Stanley made the film 7 years ago and began working on the film 7 years ago, he had no idea that the film was going to be releasing in the midst. Can we go back to the context slide? Sorry. That the film would be releasing in the midst of this movement for Black Lives, and the parallels clearly between both the Panthers organization and the evolution of that political movement and the Black Lives Matter movement were so striking, and we knew that as much as possible we wanted to use the film to make some connections and links between both movements. And then we knew that the film was going to be releasing at a time when Black folks are really communicating and organizing themselves on social media. Black Twitter is an enormous and powerful tool, and we knew that we wanted to, as much as possible, leverage Black Twitter and leverage social media as a way to both transmit ideas, participate in conversations, and support organizing that was happening online. So that was the context in which we knew the film would be releasing. Next slide. So we developed some goals around our release. Clearly, we wanted the film to reach as many people as possible over the year leading up to the national PBS broadcast, but we had some more really specific goals. We wanted the film to really deepen our nation's understanding of the Black Panther Party. We wanted to go beyond the myths and the stereotypes and the demonization and vilification of the party, but also the sort of blind celebration. And we wanted to be able to kind of dig deep and explore the legacy of the party, and particularly explore what brought the party down. So that was a really important goal. We knew that most millennials do not encounter history about the Black Panthers in their high school curriculum. So we knew that for a certain population, a certain demographic, this film was going to be their first introduction to the Panthers. If they aren't Panther cubs or Panther grandbaby cubs themselves, they may not have come across Panthers in a way beyond a sort of superficial image of an afro and someone in a leather jacket. So we knew that this film could possibly be a primary text for young folks, and that we had to surround the film with more content to help folks, young folks in particular, understand the Panthers. We also knew that baby boomers were getting a lot of their information about the Panthers through negative portrayals in the media. So we were trying to counter that as well. But we were really trying to reach young folks and both educate them on the Panthers and inspire them as they are becoming politicized through this Black Lives Matter movement. And that was a real important goal for us. We wanted to put today's social justice issues, both organizing around police brutality and government surveillance of radical activists, we wanted to put that in historical context, that Edward Snowden is not the first activist to be surveyed and suppressed, and that we have a long history of that in our community, and we wanted to put that into context with the film. And then finally, we wanted to support organizing and deepen conversations within Black organizations. We knew that there were a lot of organizations that are working heavily on the same issues the Panthers were. They could use this film as a tool, as Dante talked about, to both engage new people into their organizing efforts, and we wanted to, as much as possible, support that organizing effort by giving those organizations access to the film early. Next slide. So we developed a strategy for our release, and the first and most important start was to partner with organizations that are on the vanguard of both political and cultural organizing around our country. Dante was at our first screening. Dante saw the film before anyone at the Sundance Film Festival saw the film, and it was really important that Dante and folks like Dante, who are at the front lines of these issues, saw the film early and could advise us on the strategy for our release, could help to moderate conversations when the film had a theatrical release, could attend screenings and film festivals and bring both the what next, answer the question of what next when people saw the film in those kind of very staid environments. We wanted these organizations to frame the story, frame the issue, and bring the film to their constituents and their members. And so we engaged them to moderate conversations both online and offline. And so that first step was really partnering with organizations. We wanted to involve Panthers, and we did in every stage of the release. It was really important, I think, that this film was embraced most strongly by rank-and-file Panthers. Not the leaders and the names who are most associated with the party, but the nameless, faceless rank-and-file members who built the party, essentially, and who powered the party, and who don't have the sort of the cachet, but who really felt like their experience was really reflected in this story, why they came into the party and what it meant for them and how it politicized them and set them on a path of engagement and activism for their entire lives. So we worked with dozens and dozens and dozens of Panthers from across the country at every screening in every city that we brought the film. Those Panthers engaged with folks online and at screenings, and they were the ones who they really wanted to both connect with millennial organizers and organizers within the Black Lives Matter movement, and work alongside them and transmit knowledge and listen. But they also wanted to answer those questions of, well, what was the legacy of the Black Panther Party? That was a question that came up all the time, and they didn't want the film to answer that. They wanted to answer that in their own words. And so we wanted to make sure that wherever the film went, there was a panther that could really further that conversation. The next thing we did is we recruited influencers who could reach our target audience online and at events. And these folks were, you know, essentially high-profile organizers, cultural commentators, scholars, bloggers, celebrities. These were folks with a really large social media footprint, enormous network, respect of folks who we were trying to reach, young folks who we're trying to reach, who probably would, for no other reason, would come to a PBS broadcast if it wasn't for someone who they really respected telling them to tune in, or go to a screening if it wasn't for someone who they really respected to tell them to come to a screening because they were going to be moderating a conversation. So these folks were really our gateway. They were the folks who were framing it for folks who we were trying to reach, and we involved them in various ways. So Erykah Badu, for example, would DJ a screening party. Ava DuVernay would moderate a panel and Q&A in a Los Angeles theater. Wendell Pierce from The Wire would promote our Kickstarter campaign and tell folks why this story was so important. Sherelle Brown, Awkward Duck Online, would take over our social media pages for the Panther film for an entire week. So we were trying to engage folks in as many creative ways as possible to kind of influence and support conversations online and reach folks who normally we wouldn't be able to reach with a historical documentary. And then we wanted to create as much content so that our partners could reframe the story and the issues online. So we created clips and memes and fact sheets and supplied these partner organizations, these influencers with content that they can sort of push the ideas and the themes of the film and make them go viral. Next slide. So by the time of the broadcast in February 2016, we had already screened the film in over 250 cities across the country. We had recruited dozens of national organizations and organizers, high-profile artists, scholars, and influencers who had seen the film numerous times. For some of them, were very familiar with the film, were very familiar, much more familiar with Panther history, and they were ready and sort of mobilized towards the broadcast. And then Beyonce did her Panther tribute at the Super Bowl. God bless her soul. And, you know, I think that took many of us by surprise, and I think the backlash to her performance took her by surprise. But I think what was really important is that so many of these organizations and influencers and communities that had seen the film in the year prior leading up to the broadcast. That Super Bowl performance happened 1 week before our national PBS broadcast. So by that point, so many people had seen it that they were mobilized. They were well positioned to react to that backlash, address the myths around the Panthers, and defend what they believed was, again, another vilification of the Black Panther Party. And so I think that really speaks to the fact that this sort of new narrative had emboldened a lot of folks to reframe the story and disrupt a narrative that they saw going in a similar direction that was going to dehumanize our community and our organizing efforts. So when we had a live Twitter chat during the broadcast, those folks, those influencers, those organizations really turned that live Twitter chat into a cultural moment and a teachable moment to talk about Panther history. So when the film had a broadcast, we had over 3.9 million people watched it in that first week. The hashtag for the film trended on Twitter for 5 hours globally. It was the highest rated program on public television ever, the highest rated documentary on public television ever. And we were having a conversation where folks were watching the film with us, and that was like from a 16-year-old YouTube star to Gwen Ifill from PBS to John Legend. We're watching the film with us and having a conversation on Twitter about this history. And so it was a really important moment. And what's really striking is that, you know, despite the fact that the film has been so well received both during the broadcast and the year prior, you know, part of the reason why I took Stanley Nelson, who's an award-winning filmmaker who's won essentially every media award possible, it took him 7 years to make this film, partly because he couldn't get the film funded. And not only was it very difficult to get the film funded, we were not able to fund an impact campaign around the film because no one could imagine what would we do with a film about the Panthers. How could we, what are we trying to tell people to do with a film about the Panthers? Are we trying to arm the next generation? Like, what's the takeaway? So, so no one could really see it until it happened, and we had to raise our own money and invest in it and bring it to the folks who we knew could turn a really powerful story into a really powerful organizing moment. So some lessons that we learned from that, next slide, is that, because of the, the sort of the direct action organizing and the sort of confrontational nature of the Black Lives Matter movement, we see that there's a real hunger for stories of our own resistance, of our resiliency, of this unapologetic Blackness. Firelight's been making films about civil rights moments and actors for many years, but the way this film has been received speaks much more to the moment that we're in and the appetite for stories that really center our resistance and strategy. But we also know that the Black Lives Matter, being a movement that is really being led by women, being led by queer folks, that there's a pushback to narratives around our organizing efforts that center this sort of heterosexual male leadership, the singular male charismatic leader. That trope is no longer resonating with folks anymore, and that there's a real pushback when even filmmakers and storytellers like us fall into that as well. And so I think there's a real hunger for stories about our organizing efforts, about historically and contemporarily, that really center women's leadership, queer stories, but also go beyond, as Nat talked about. This movement for Black Lives is not simply about pushing back against state violence and police violence. It's also about our own healing. It's about self-love. And those are stories that I think within this moment of movement for Black Lives, there's a real craving for those stories. I think the lessons we also learned is that our communities are not passive audiences. They shape as much as they consume. The film and the movement was being critiqued as much as it was being celebrated. And we supported that, and we were happy to see that. But I think it reminded us, our community wants to be able to interact, mash up, change, push back, celebrate all at the same time. And we need to enable that as much as possible. And then finally, there's value in speaking to one another with these stories. We oftentimes, as filmmakers, think about mainstream audiences. We translate our experience. We try to build empathy for our experience and our struggle by talking to other people. Our community, and in particular younger folks, I think in this moment, really want stories that we want to talk to one another. We want to sort of reflect our own beauty and struggle and share our experience to one another, so that there's real value in doing that still. And then the last slide, in terms of recommendations, I think Dante said this, but essentially cultural change really precedes political change. And we need more narratives that fuel these change efforts. And to have more narratives, we need more storytellers, and we need to have a greater investment in filmmakers and filmmaking. And that's why we have our documentary lab, where we're supporting the next generation of filmmakers of color, but we need more investment there. Next, we need to close the gap between filmmakers, advocates, artists, philanthropy, to start thinking about the narratives that need disrupting and new narratives that need telling. When we can bring the groups together in some of the ways that I think Nat talked about, sort of cross-issue, we can start to identify narratives and places for intervention of narratives. And then finally, we need to understand the future of storytelling. Virtual reality, immersive technology, interactive media is really the future, and it's upon us. But too few of us are experimenting in those spaces. They really provide an opportunity to shape, to tell our stories in really new and powerful ways, but we have to be willing to invest in experimenting in those spaces and in those new storytelling platforms. So I think there's a real opportunity there. but we have to step into it boldly, and we have to step into it now before we're sort of behind the 8 ball.
Sonia, thank you for that. Sonia, thank you for that. And there's so much richness here. I really want to open it up for the questions that have come through. So with that, Takani, could you go to the next slide so we can open up the Q&A? And if you don't mind, if there are a handful of questions that you could actually, Takani, that you could read to us, great. While you're doing that, I'll let you organize your questions before that. Something that came across all the presentations was the space of actually building Black consciousness, right? The philanthropic industry, using arts and culture, and within activism. And so I know something that we're oftentimes left, goes to Sonia's last point, is actually how do you prove that what you're doing is working? And so my first question is a harder question, but I think it's really important, in particular for this audience, and it's oftentimes met this level of resistance to really say, you know, why is this work important? What is its ultimate outcome? So I want to start with Dante to open us up, and then we'll just go to Sonia and Nat, and then we'll go right to the open Q&A. So Dante, can you start us off?
Yeah, so we launched a training program called the Elevator Leadership Program in April, and it's a year-long investment to train emerging leaders from our organization, about 15, 20 folks from our organization who are leading campaigns, who are leading their chapters or whatever. And we had one of our members from our Riverside, California chapter who was pretty new into the organization. And went through the first training, which was based on the fundamentals of organizing and going through some understanding some of the systems and all those different things. And a couple weeks later, I see on Twitter how much that one training impacted her, how that training impacted her investment in being a part of Million Hoodies and being connected to a community who are just as crazy as she has. One of the things when I went to actually visit her chapter a few weeks ago, and she talks about that, about the fact that I did not know there's just as many crazy people like I am, and who are thinking about these things in the way that I am. And so, one, there's a need and desire for young Black people to be in community with other young Black people. And that's how I know that this is working. It's because of the consciousness is increasing by being in relationship with other young Black people and being challenged. We're about to head into our national convening in August in Greensboro, North Carolina. And one of the things that we're thinking about is creating a space creating a fishbowl space to really wrestle with some of these key questions in a way for everyone to be participatory in those questions, and to be challenged by your peers about the directions of an organization, to be challenged by our peers by the direction of where we want the country to move forward in terms of building a democracy. And these are the spaces that we foster this conversation. We foster the political consciousness and the consciousness raising. It's through these conversations. But also, and I'll close, is that a big part, we would not be anywhere if it wasn't for our elders. I have the fortune and the luck, I'm grateful to it. Not many folks can, but I have the fortune of being also mentored by a lot of the former New York Black Panthers, particularly Omar Babur and a few other folks who are now leading the organization Alumni Association for the Black Panther Party and coordinating the anniversary events. We've brought them into our spaces, and the ability for us to be in intergenerational conversation about what they went through and about the challenges and the things that they're thinking about, and connect them to our folks who are thinking about the same thing, it's amazing. And it creates more opportunities for political consciousness raising.
Nat or Sonia, do you guys have anything brief to share before we go to the audience Q&A?
Yeah, I'll share it real briefly. So as part of the Black Social Change Funders Network, that's the core question that we have to, that we're trying to address over the next 6 months, and to actually put out and develop a case statement for why is it important, and why should philanthropy actually invest heavily and perpetually in Black-led, in particular, not just Black social change, but Black-led social change infrastructure. And so two quick responses, and I'm hopefully we'll go beyond this. One is that Black people suffered 50 years ago. In many ways, we're at the same level in terms of the racial disparities, a whole range of issues, and in a lot of areas, we're worse. And so if foundations are actually about trying to improve quality of life for residents here, the Black community is one of the prime residents that we need to have some focus on, because we've been stagnating in our growth. The other side, though, so that's kind of like, do it because people are suffering. The other side, though, is do it because that's the way we get free, right? And so with people talk a lot about multiracial coalitions and the rising American electorate, but that electorate and that new coalition is only as strong as its constituent movements, right? And so it's inconceivable to me to think that the progressive movement thinks that it can actually achieve its most ambitious goal without a strong Black infrastructure for power building, right? And so that's the positive. It's like, if you want to win, then you need to invest in us so we could all win together.
Sonia, do you have anything you want to add?
Oh, yeah, I would just, what we feel like at Firelight, we're on the right track when we're able to position historical documentaries as tools to feed and support contemporary social justice organizing, and that the organizations at the forefront of this movement, both politically and culturally, look to us as content creators, as partners. That to us is a real signal that we're on the right track. So when our films may not be, shortlisted for an Academy nomination, but get 3.8 million viewers, mostly young folks of color, that to us signals we're doing something right. And so I think some of those are our internal metrics for success, and for the kind of power of narrative and the power of culture within political organizing.
Thank you. Absi, I know that you've been collecting some questions along the conversation, so let's go ahead and have a menu of questions.
Sure, we actually have a couple of questions. The first question, I think, is addressed to Nat, asking if he could clarify what 3 types of Black power that he was referring to. I think he said social, institutional, and one of the audience members wanted clarity on the third one. Another question that's open to all the panelists are any of our panelists familiar with giving circles with the Community Investment Network? If so, do you know of giving circles that have been successful to aid in fundraising for social justice issues? Another question, this one is directed to Sonia. Is there anything in the pipeline about Assata Shakur's life? Curious being that the Cuba and U.S. relations are changing and she's aging. If an opportunity, is there an opportunity in the works for Firelight? And that's all we have so far.
Great questions.
Okay, do you want me to go first?
Yeah, I think the first question was,
all right.
Go ahead,
well,
Tanya.
So the one about what type of power I was talking about, so it's Black social power. Again, that's the ability to basically influence, change the way that people perceive social issues, and also see themselves relative to other people, right? There's Black institutional power, having the actual organizational capacity to carry forward and develop and carry forward the agenda for change. And Black political power was the last one, and that's the ability to actually influence and change systems. And so you need all of those that complex of power working together, I think, in order to not just create social change, but in our particular framing, you need that in order to make Black Lives Matter. It's not just about changing hearts and minds. Fundamentally, it's about power. And some folks sometimes ask, well, why don't you include economic power as a part of that? And I think, for me, economic power in the Black community as a political tool is kind of a byproduct or used as a tool in the strategy once you have sufficient social, institutional, and political power, right? Once you're able to call a boycott, you can't just call a boycott. You need to have institutional power, you need to have kind of political direction, and you need to have some social cachet. So individual dollars do not combine disaggregated to political institutional power. So I'll leave that there.
Thanks. Go ahead.
So just to repeat the second question, are there any of our panelists familiar with giving circles with Community Investment Network? If so, do you know of giving circles that have been successful to aid in fundraising for social justice issues?
And if no one has any examples, I'd like to cite one. This is Edward. Our giving circle, Black Benefactors, actually took one of those steps and funded a local DC-based organization called One DC, which is an organization that's focusing on affordable housing and keeping indigenous peoples and original families in the district in place and in position. And it's not a very popular role in a space where folks are often fighting for, the capitalist focus on increasing rent prices and such. And so we took that bold move really with the intent to start being intentional around supporting Black-led organizations, particularly those organizations that are not getting funded through mainstream philanthropy. So that's just one example I'd like to lift out there, and I think there will be more done through the Community Investment Network as we learn more about this movement in the Black social change work. And it's not necessarily, I don't know if you I'm sorry.
No, I was wondering, Dante, but what about the Black Scholar Fund? Would that be considered a giving circle?
Yeah, that would be one. So there was an effort put together by Dr. Kathy Cohen, Barbara Ransby, Robin Kelly, and Donna Murch to organize Black academics and Black scholars around the country to support 5 Black organizations, including Million Hoodies, BYP 100, Hands Up United, Black Lives Matter, the Network, along with, I'm missing one other one. But there's like about 4 or 5, African American Policy Forum as well. And they organized about $20,000 total that folks contributed about from $10 to $500 based upon their status at their school, whether they have the tenure status or if they're an associate professor or whatever it is. And as an effort to say that Black academics and Black scholars are in this movement and that we're going to use and organize our resources to visibly do this. And so they send out a big letter. And so you can definitely find it probably online. It's called Black Scholars for Black Life. But that's definitely one giving circle that folks were organically creating themselves.
And there was a question for Sonia, I believe.
Yeah, so that question was, is there anything in the pipeline about Assata Shakur's life? Curious being that the Cuba and U.S. relations are changing and she's aging. If an opportunity is there an opportunity in the works for Firelight Media?
The answer is unfortunately no. There's no plan at this point to tell Assata's story. But for folks who aren't aware, there's a really strong documentary. It's somewhat dated, It's very dated, but it's still a really strong film by Afro-Cuban filmmaker Gloria Rolando, called Eyes of the Rainbow. It tells Asada's story. They're close friends, and it tells Asada's story about her life in Cuba and her time in exile. So that's a really strong film, the best thing I've seen about Asada's story. There's no plans at Firelight to tell her story, but certainly we're all really sympathetic to her political situation and are hopeful and supportive of any kind of organizing to help her stay in Cuba or come back without being prosecuted. I will say for folks who are interested, though, Stanley's The Panthers was the first installment of a three-part film series called America Revisited, and the other two films are, one's in production and the third is soon to be in production. So the second film that Stanley's working on right now is a history of historically black colleges and universities. It's the first documentary on HBCUs. It will take a look at the development and evolution of HBCUs from the very first HBCU to today. So it tells essentially our epic struggle for access to an education. So that will be ready most likely and to premiere next year, and we're in production on that one. And then the film following that is a look at the economics of the transatlantic slave trade. And that will look at essentially how the slave trade built the economies of not only the United States, but the New World in the Americas and Europe as well. And so not a slave narrative film, but really looking at economics. So those are the next films. And then there's also a film in the works about the story of John Lewis. But unfortunately not a story about Assata Shakur. And there are, I should just say as a plug, there are many other women organizers in our history that need their stories told. And as much as possible, we want to support that. And we want women filmmakers in particular to tell those stories because it's absolutely time.
Great. We just have a couple more questions. First one is, outside of political consciousness raising, power building, intergenerational organizing around cultural resources, how can you get youth interested in black culture? Does this fit in Sonia's piece about self-love and how you do it? There's another clarifying question. One of the audience members would like to understand the difference between black historical culture and black heritage.
And if we could address, if we could address those two questions quickly so we don't lose the audience.
I missed her. I couldn't hear the first question correctly. I just want to see if we can rephrase the question.
So essentially, it's how can you get youth interested in black culture? Is this related to Sonia's discussion around self-love? And if so, how do you do it?
I think black youth are not already interested in black culture because they're creating it. But I think it's a matter of reaching black youth with culture that's being created, whether it's film or music or art. I think where the tension is and where the challenge is in getting it in front of young folks. The distribution platforms are changing, both for recording artists, for filmmakers, that the old ways and traditional ways of reaching an audience are changing every day. And so I think the challenge is how to get content and stories and art and music in front of black young folks. But I don't think, but the reception to that is never seems to be the problem. That's not really where the challenge is. And in terms of just a sort of a desire for stories of self-love, I mean, again, that's just, it's really easy to continue telling stories about our resistance. But I think what the Black Lives Matter movement reminds us is that we should be equally considering and thinking about and foregrounding what the society that we want to see. What's the end goal? What's the vision? And we have to envision that. And that's really the space where artists come in, is to envision what it is we want to see and help us see it and help us work towards it and encourage us to work towards it. So I think those kinds of narratives are as important as the narratives about what we've gone through to get here.
Hey, Dante, before you wrap up, before we get to the wrap up, could you talk a little bit more about Push Black, which is another medium that's emerging as far as getting information out, current as well as historical?
Yeah, I'll share a little bit about that, and I was going to add one other thing to Sonia's point.
Okay.
So we launched a partnership with a Black startup called Push Black, and launched a new media tool called Push Black Now, which sends text messages to your phone every day about Black news. We know that normal mainstream media news is not covering the issues that we care about or about us or about the way that we live, and it's often criminalizing. We often are in the news a lot for more things that are related to crime and not necessarily our livelihood or safety or anything like that. And so we launched this partnership to, one, use as a form of political education for a network of folks that are subscribed to this list. And we're also able to share and publicize and promote the work that our members are doing. So if there's an action that our Greensboro chapter is doing, we can send that out to our North Carolina list. That also connects some of the things that they're sharing about in the news and on their text messages. So it's a new tool. You can go to Million Hoodies, our website, millionhoodies.net, to sign up to get a subscribe to the list. And it's a really cool way to just get connected to media that we often are not necessarily hearing about. Then the close, I'll say that one thing that I think is really, really important, and I didn't really get to speak too much a lot around this. So I'm assuming that folks who are on this call, on this webinar, are familiar with the name Marshawn McCarroll. He was the Black organizer in Ohio who committed suicide. I was really, really good friends with him. I knew him, and I have been organizing together through a network of young Black and brown people called Freedom Side. That was a formation formed after the March on Washington anniversary in 2013. And Marshawn and I have been really close friends, and I think a lot about Marshawn when I hear about self-love and I hear about healing, and I also hear about some of the conditions that Black organizers are in right now. Is that many Black organizers are not only organizing, but they're also homeless or working 3 jobs or doing X, Y, or Z while they're organizing. And that produces a lot of trauma, that produces a lot of PTSD. And so if I want to say anything about self-love, is also just thinking about resources, thinking about how can we invest in supporting the organizers who are doing the work, because oftentimes they're also the ones that are suffering a lot of the conditions. And I always say this, that organizing is about changing conditions in people's lives. But if the folks that are doing the organizing are not having their conditions changed, then I think that's a real problem.
I think that's an excellent way for us to end this conversation, in all frankness. Again, this will not be the last conversation around this topic, but I do want to thank Nat, Sonia, and Dante for sharing your time and your brilliance in this very illuminating conversation. I am looking forward to the next steps, and now I want to pass it over to Afi for closing statement. Edward, are you there?
I am, and again, I just want to thank everyone for being a part of this, and also invite those that are online, including those of you that are speaking, to think about and help us think about what should the next conversation be, and who else do we need in the room that's not in the room or in the virtual space. So as you take this, as you digest it, as we repost it, we will post this information on the web, on our website, adfe.org, and invite you all to share it with other colleagues and other folks in your networks, because the movement will not fund itself. We need to be a part of that movement building and movement support. And so thank you all for the work that you're doing, and let the conversations and the action continue. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you all.